The avoidant doesn't run from love, they run from losing themselves inside it. What most people misunderstand about avoidant personalities is that they do not withdraw because they feel nothing. They withdraw because emotional pressure feels invasive to them. The more someone chases, demands clarity, or constantly seeks reassurance, the more they will learn to trust their instincts and make decisions based on their own judgment. The more the avoidant nervous system interprets connection as a threat to personal freedom. And this is why one of the strongest psychological turn-ons for an avoidant is not intensity, but emotional non-chasing. There is something profoundly disarming about a person who remains emotionally steady without trying to force closeness. Most people, when they sense distance, panic. They text more. They seek validation. They attempt to pull the avoidant back into connection through emotional urgency. But psychologically, this often produces the opposite effect. The avoidant begins to feel trapped, observed, and emotionally cornered. Distance then becomes their method of self-protection. But when someone responds differently with calmness, patience, and inner stability, a very unusual psychological process begins to unfold. The avoidant no longer feels hunted. They no longer feel responsible for managing another person's emotional state. For perhaps the first time, connection feels voluntary instead of obligatory. And this matters deeply, because avoidants are extraordinarily sensitive to emotional control, even in subtle forms. They can detect when affection contains hidden dependency. They can sense when love is mixed with possession. What attracts them is the rare individual who says, psychologically speaking, I value connection, but I will not abandon myself to keep it. That energy creates respect. And for the avoidant mind, respect often comes before trust. Carl Jung once suggested that what we resist most strongly often contains the very thing the psyche secretly longs for. Avoidants resist emotional engulfment because somewhere within them exists a profound desire for intimacy that does not erase the self. So when they encounter someone emotionally grounded, someone capable of closeness without desperation, it interrupts their expectations. The avoidant begins to lean forward emotionally because they no longer feel forced. This is why emotional restraint is not weakness. In mature psychology, restraint can become a form of power, not coldness, not manipulation, but the ability to remain centered without chasing what fears being captured. And sometimes, the deepest form of attraction is giving someone enough safety that they no longer feel the need to run. One of the deepest psychological cravings within avoidant individuals is the desire to be understood without feeling emotionally exposed. And this contradiction defines much of their inner world. They often want connection, but fear what connection might uncover. They want intimacy, but become guarded the moment they sense someone trying to psychologically enter them too quickly. This is why many avoidants become intensely affected by people who can perceive their emotional reality without forcing confession. Most individuals approach emotional distance like a problem to solve. They interrogate it. They personalize it. They demand explanations for every shift in mood or behavior. But the avoidant psyche experiences this as intrusion rather than care. The more they feel examined, the more they retreat behind emotional walls. Yet there is a rare kind of emotional intelligence that changes this dynamic completely. It appears when someone notices the silence without attacking it, when they recognize the contradiction without trying to expose it publicly, when they understand that distance is often a defense mechanism, not a declaration of indifference. Psychologically, this creates enormous relief inside the avoidant nervous system, because many avoidants secretly carry shame around their inability to express affection consistently. They know they can appear cold one moment and deeply attached the next. They often confuse even themselves. And over time, they become accustomed to being misunderstood, labeled detached, uncaring, selfish, or emotionally unavailable. But when someone sees beneath the behavior instead of reacting only to the behavior, something begins to soften internally. The avoidant no longer feels reduced to a diagnosis or a stereotype. They feel psychologically recognized. Carl Jung believed that much of human suffering comes from the fear of being fully seen without being accepted. For avoidance, this fear becomes especially powerful because vulnerability has often been associated with danger, disappointment, or loss of autonomy. So they learn to conceal emotional depth beneath control and distance. But when another person demonstrates quiet understanding without emotional force, the avoidant experiences a rare form of safety. Not the safety of dependency, but the safety of not having to constantly defend themselves psychologically. And this becomes profoundly attractive because true understanding is rarer than desire. Lust may capture attention for a moment, but feeling emotionally understood without being pressured to perform creates something far deeper: trust. And the moment a person feels safe enough to stop hiding, their entire inner world begins to change. Avoidant individuals are often far more perceptive than people realize. They constantly observe emotional energy, social behavior, and the psychological intentions behind attraction. And because of this heightened sensitivity, they are rarely drawn toward desperation, emotional dependency, or the need for constant validation. In fact, those behaviors tend to activate withdrawal almost immediately. What truly captures an avoidant's attention is something far quieter and far more powerful: emotional independence. There is a particular kind of person who unsettles the avoidant psyche in an unexpected way. It is the individual who seems emotionally complete within themselves. Someone who enjoys connection but does not emotionally collapse without it. Someone whose identity, purpose, and inner stability exist independently of external reassurance. This kind of presence creates fascination because it feels emotionally safe. Most people assume attraction is created through intensity, but psychologically, avoidants are often drawn toward containment rather than emotional overflow. Excessive pursuit feels heavy to them because it silently communicates expectation. It implies obligation, and obligation is precisely what the avoidant nervous system resists. But quiet confidence produces a completely different reaction. It creates space. It removes pressure. The avoidant no longer feels responsible for carrying another person's emotional needs. Instead, they begin observing someone who appears grounded, self-respecting, and internally secure. And this awakens something important within them: respect. For avoidance, respect frequently becomes the doorway to attraction long before emotional vulnerability does. Carl Jung spoke often about individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole within oneself rather than seeking completion through others. Avoidants, consciously or unconsciously, are deeply responsive to people who embody this principle. They admire individuals who possess emotional discipline, self-awareness, and direction because these qualities feel stable rather than consuming. And there is another reason this dynamic affects them so deeply. Many avoidants secretly fear emotional engulfment. They fear losing themselves inside relationships. So when they encounter someone who clearly possesses a strong sense of self, it changes the emotional equation. Connection no longer feels like absorption. It feels like two complete individuals choosing one another freely. This is why emotional independence becomes intensely magnetic. Not because it plays games or withholds affection, but because it communicates emotional maturity. It says, "I can love deeply without abandoning myself." And in a world addicted to emotional chasing, the rarest form of attraction is often the person who remains fully grounded while still remaining open to love. There is a common misconception that avoidants are emotionally detached because they lack depth. In reality, many avoidants are deeply stimulated by emotional complexity, but they become overwhelmed when intimacy unfolds too quickly or too predictably. What often draws them in is not emotional intensity alone, but the subtle tension between warmth and mystery. Most people reveal themselves immediately when attraction begins. They explain everything they feel, expose every insecurity, and make their emotional availability completely visible from the start. While this may create temporary closeness, it can unintentionally remove the psychological space that allows curiosity to grow. And for avoidance, curiosity is extremely important because it creates emotional movement without pressure. The avoidant psyche is highly responsive to what remains partially undiscovered. Not deception, not manipulation, but emotional depth that unfolds gradually rather than all at once. When someone is warm yet still connected to their own private inner world, the avoidant begins to lean in psychologically. They start wondering, observing, thinking about the person in their absence. And this matters because avoidants are often internally conflicted about closeness itself. One part of them desires intimacy, while another part fears being emotionally consumed by it. So when a relationship becomes too emotionally intense too quickly, their instinct is often to create distance in order to regain psychological control. But mystery changes the rhythm entirely. It allows connection to breathe. Carl Jung understood that human beings are naturally drawn toward what he called the unknown aspects of the psyche. We are fascinated by what cannot be fully possessed or completely explained. And in relationships, this principle becomes powerful. When a person maintains individuality, emotional depth, and a sense of inner richness beyond the relationship itself, they remain psychologically compelling. Avoidants especially respond to this because emotional predictability can sometimes feel suffocating to them. If they feel they already know exactly where the relationship is going, the emotional tension disappears. But when warmth is balanced with subtle unpredictability, when affection exists without emotional overexposure, attraction remains alive. This does not mean playing games or becoming emotionally unavailable. Immaturity creates confusion, but mature mystery is different. It is the ability to remain authentic while still allowing parts of yourself to unfold naturally over time. And perhaps this is what keeps human connection alive at its deepest level. The realization that love does not require total possession to remain meaningful. Sometimes attraction grows strongest in the spaces where curiosity still has room to breathe. One of the greatest misunderstandings about avoidant individuals is the assumption that they are afraid of love itself. In many cases, this is not true at all. What they fear is the loss of autonomy that often comes disguised as love. They fear relationships that slowly demand the surrender of individuality, emotional space, and psychological freedom. And because of this, one of the strongest emotional turn-ons for an avoidant is the experience of freedom inside connection. Most relationships begin with attraction, but eventually shift toward control in subtle ways. Expectations increase. Emotional demands become heavier. Personal boundaries start dissolving. One partner begins needing constant access, constant reassurance, constant emotional presence. For many people, this may feel normal, but for avoidants, it can feel suffocating. The avoidant number. Erbil's system becomes highly reactive when connection starts feeling like captivity. Not because they do not care, but because their inner world is deeply protective of independence. Many avoidants learned early in life that closeness came with pressure, criticism, emotional unpredictability, or the expectation to abandon parts of themselves to maintain attachment. So as adults, they often associate intimacy with psychological confinement. But something remarkable happens when they encounter a relationship built differently. A connection where space is not interpreted as rejection. A connection where individuality is not seen as emotional disloyalty. A connection where both people are allowed to remain fully themselves without constant emotional monitoring. This creates emotional safety in a form avoidants rarely experience. Carl Jung believed that psychological health depends on maintaining contact with the authentic self. The tragedy of many relationships is that people slowly betray their individuality in order to secure attachment. But avoidants are unusually sensitive to this dynamic. The moment they feel their identity dissolving inside a relationship, withdrawal becomes an act of self-preservation. This is why freedom becomes deeply attractive to them. Not freedom from love, but freedom within love. The ability to breathe emotionally while remaining connected. The ability to disappear into solitude without punishment. The ability to maintain personal identity while still building intimacy. And paradoxically, this freedom often creates stronger attachment, not weaker attachment. Because when people no longer feel trapped, they stop needing to escape. The deepest relationships are not the ones built on possession. They are the ones where two individuals can stand close to one another without forcing either soul into captivity. And sometimes the purest form of love is giving another person enough freedom that they choose to stay without being held. Perhaps the deepest psychological turn-on for an avoidant is something most people never think to offer them. The experience of being seen as capable rather than broken. Modern culture has a habit of reducing complex human behavior into labels and deficiencies. The avoidant becomes emotionally unavailable, cold, damaged, or incapable of love. And while these descriptions may appear insightful, on the surface they often fail to recognize the hidden psychological reality underneath. Many avoidants are not lacking emotion at all. In fact, they frequently feel emotions with enormous intensity. The difference is that they have learned to control, conceal, or compartmentalize those emotions as a form of protection. But over time, constantly being interpreted through the lens of dysfunction creates quiet shame. The avoidant begins expecting judgment the moment intimacy deepens. They anticipate being analyzed, corrected, or emotionally managed. And because of this expectation, they often keep large parts of themselves hidden long before anyone has the chance to reject them directly. This is why something profoundly transformative occurs when another person responds differently. Instead of approaching the avoidant like a psychological problem to solve, they approach them with respect. They recognize the strength beneath the distance. They understand that emotional restraint is not always emotional emptiness. And most importantly, they communicate directly or indirectly, "I do not see you as broken." That moment can disarm years of internal defense. Carl Jung